Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton. The Springfield Fox. The hens had been mysteriously disappearing for over a month, and when I came home to Springfield for the summer holidays, it was my duty to find the cause. This was soon done. The fowls were carried away bodily one at a time before going to roost or else after leaving, which put tramps and neighbors out of court. They were not taken from the high perches, which cleared all coons and owls, or left partly eaten so that weasels, skunks, or minks were not the guilty ones, and the blame, therefore, was surely left at Reynard's door. The great pine wood of Arundel was on the other bank of the river, and on looking carefully about the lower ford, I saw a few fox tracks and a barred feather from one of our Plymouth Rock chickens. On climbing the farther bank in search of more dews, I heard a great outcry of crows behind me, and turning, saw a number of these birds darting down at something in the ford. A better view showed that it was the old story, thief catch thief. For there in the middle of the ford was a fox with something in his jaws. He was returning from our barnyard with another hen. The crows, though shameless robbers themselves, are ever first to cry, "Stop thief," and yet more than ready to take hush money in the form of a share in the plunder. And this was their game now. The fox, to get back home, must cross the river, where he was exposed to the full brunt of the crow mob. He made a dash for it, and would doubtless have gotten across with his booty had I not joined in the attack, whereupon he dropped the hen, scarce dead, and disappeared in the woods. This large and regular levy of provisions, wholly carried off, could mean but one thing: a family of little foxes at home, and to find them I now was bound. That evening I went with Ranger, my hound, across the river into the Arundel woods. As soon as the hound began to circle, we heard the short, sharp bark of a fox from a thickly wooded ravine close by. Ranger dashed in at once, struck a hot scent, and went off on a lively straightaway till his voice was lost in the distance away over the upland. After nearly an hour he came back, panting and warm, for it was baking August weather, and lay down at my feet. But almost immediately the same foxy yap yurr was heard close at hand, and off dashed the dog on another chase. Away he went in the darkness, baying like a foghorn, straight away to the north, and the loud boo, boo became a low ooh, ooh, and that a feeble oh, oh, and then was lost. They must have gone some miles away, for even with ear to the ground I heard nothing of them, though a mile was easy distance for Ranger's brazen voice. As I waited in the black woods, I heard a sweet sound of dripping water. Tink-tank, tink-tink, to tink-tank, tank-tonk. I did not know of any spring so near, and in the hot night it was a glad find. But the sound led me to the bough of an oak tree, where I found its source. Such a soft, sweet song, full of delightful suggestion on such a night. Tonk tank tank tink, ta tink a tonk, a tank a tink, a ta ta tink tank, ta ta tonk tink, drink a tank, a drink a drunk. It was the water-dripping song of the saw-wet owl. But suddenly a deep, raucous breathing and a rustle of leaves showed that Ranger was back. He was completely fagged out. His tongue hung almost to the ground and was dripping with foam. His flanks were heaving, and spume flecks dribbled from his breast and sides. He stopped panting a moment to give my hand a dutiful lick, then flung himself flop on the leaves to drown all other sounds with his noisy panting. But again that tantalizing yap-yurr was heard a few feet away, and the meaning of it all dawned on me. We were close to the den where the little foxes were, and the old ones were taking turns in trying to lead us away. It was late night now, so we went home feeling sure that the problem was nearly solved. It was well known that there was an old fox with his family living in the neighborhood, but no one supposed them so near. This fox had been called Scarface because of a scar reaching from his eye through and back of his ear. This was supposed to have been given him by a barbed wire fence during a rabbit hunt, and as the hair came in white after it healed, it was always a strong mark. The winter before I had met with him and had had a sample of his craftiness. I was out shooting after a fall of snow and had crossed the open fields to the edge of the brushy hollow back of the old mill. As my head rose to a view of the hollow, I caught sight of a fox trotting at long range down the other side, in line to cross my course. Instantly, I held motionless and did not even lower or turn my head lest I should catch his eye by moving until he went on out of sight in the thick cover at the bottom. As soon as he was hidden, I bobbed down and ran to head him off where he should leave the cover on the other side, and was there in good time awaiting, but no fox came forth. A careful look showed the fresh track of a fox that had bounded from the cover, and following it with my eye, I saw old Scarface himself far out of range behind me, sitting on his haunches and grinning as though much amused. A study of the trail made all clear. He had seen me at the moment I saw him, but he also, like a true hunter, had concealed the fact, putting on an air of unconcern till out of sight, when he had run for his life around behind me and amused himself by watching my stillborn trick. In the springtime, I had yet another instance of Scarface's cunning. I was walking with a friend along the road over the high pasture. We passed within 30 feet of a ridge on which were several gray and brown boulders, when at the nearest point my friend said, "Stone number 3 looks to me very much like a fox curled up," but I could not see it, and we passed. We had not gone many yards farther when the wind blew on this boulder as on fur. My friend said, "I am sure that is a fox, lying asleep." "We'll soon settle that," I replied, and turned back. But as soon as I had taken one step from the road, up jumped Scarface, for it was he, and ran. A fire had swept the middle of the pasture, leaving a broad belt of black. Over this he scurried till he came to the unburnt yellow grass again, where he squatted down and was lost to view. He had been watching us all the time, and would not have moved had we kept to the road. The wonderful part of this is, not that he resembled the round stones and dry grass, but that he knew he did and was ready to profit by it. We soon found that it was Scarface and his wife Vixen that had made our woods their home, and our barnyard their base of supplies. Next morning, a search in the pines showed a great bank of earth that had been scratched up within a few months. It must have come from a hole, and yet there was none to be seen. It is well known that a really cute fox, on digging a new den, brings all the earth out at the first hole made, but carries on a tunnel into some distant thicket. Then, closing up for good, the first made and too well-marked door uses only the entrance hidden in the thicket. So after a little search at the other side of a knoll, I found the real entry and good proof that there was a nest of little foxes inside. Rising above the brush on the hillside was a great hollow basswood. It leaned a good deal and had a large hole at the bottom and a smaller one at top. We boys had often used this tree in playing Swiss Family Robinson, and by cutting steps in its soft, punky walls, had made it easy to go up and down in the hollow. Now it came in handy, for next day when the sun was warm, I went there to watch, and from this perch on the roof, I soon saw the interesting family that lived in the cellar nearby. There were 4 little foxes. They looked curiously like little lambs, with their woolly coats, their long, thick legs, and innocent expressions, and yet a second glance at their broad, sharp-nosed, sharp-eyed visages showed that each of these innocents was the makings of a crafty old fox. They played about, basking in the sun, or wrestling with each other till a slight sound made them scurry underground. But their alarm was needless, for the cause of it was their mother. She stepped from the bushes bringing another hen, number 17 as I remember. A low call from her and the little fellows came tumbling out. Then began a scene that I thought charming, but which my uncle would not have enjoyed at all. They rushed on the hen and tussled and fought with it, and each other, while the mother, keeping a sharp eye for enemies, looked on with fond delight. The expression on her face was remarkable. It was first a grinning of delight, but her usual look of wildness and cunning was there. Nor were cruelty and nervousness lacking, but over all was the unmistakable look of the mother's pride and love. The base of my tree was hidden in bushes and much lower than the knoll where the den was, so I could come and go at will without scaring the foxes. For many days I went there and saw much of the training of the young ones. They early learned to turn to statuettes sound, and then on hearing it again or finding other cause for fear, to run for shelter. Some animals have so much mother love that it overflows and benefits outsiders. Not so old Vixen, it would seem. Her pleasure in the cubs led to most refined cruelty, for she often brought home to them mice and birds alive, and with diabolic gentleness would avoid doing them serious hurt so that the cubs might have larger scope to torment them. There was a woodchuck that lived over in the hill orchard. He was neither handsome nor interesting, but he knew how to take care of himself. He had dug a den between the roots of an old pine stump so that the foxes could not follow him by digging. But hard work was not their way of life, which they believed worth more than elbow grease. This woodchuck usually sunned himself on the stump each morning. If he saw a fox near, he went down in the door of his den, or if the enemy was very near, he went inside and stayed long enough for the danger to pass. One morning, Vixen and her mate seemed to decide that it was time the children knew something about the broad subject of woodchucks, and further that this orchard woodchuck would serve nicely for an object lesson. So they went together to the orchard fence unseen by old Chucky on his stump. Scarface then showed himself in the orchard and quietly walked in a line so as to pass by the stump at a distance, but never once turned his head or allowed the ever-watchful woodchuck to think himself seen. When the fox entered the field, the woodchuck quietly dropped down to the mouth of his den. Here he waited as the fox passed, but concluding that after all wisdom is the better part, went into his hole. This was what the foxes wanted. Vixen had kept out of sight, but now ran swiftly to the stump and hid behind it. Scarface had kept straight on, going very slowly. The woodchuck had not been frightened, so before long his head popped up between the roots and he looked around. There was that fox still going on, farther and farther away. The woodchuck grew bold as the fox went and came out farther, and then seeing the coast clear, he scrambled onto the stump, and with one spring Vixen had him and shook him till he lay senseless. Scarface had watched out of the corner of his eye and now came running back. But Vixen took the chuck in her jaws and made for the den, so he saw he wasn't needed. Back to the den came Vix and carried the chuck so carefully that he was able to struggle a little when she got there. A low woof at the den brought the little fellows out like schoolboys to play. She threw the wounded animal to them and they set on him like four little furies, uttering little growls and biting little bites with all the strength of their baby jaws. But the woodchuck fought for his life and beating them off, slowly hobbled to the shelter of a thicket. The little ones pursued like a pack of hounds and dragged at his tail and flanks, but could not hold him back. So Vixen overtook him with a couple of bounds and dragged him again into the open for the children to worry. Again and again this rough sport went on till one of the little ones was badly bitten, and his squeal of pain roused Vix to end the woodchuck's misery and serve him up at once. Not far from the den was a hollow overgrown with coarse grass, the playground of a colony of field mice. The earliest lesson in woodcraft that the little ones took away from the den was in this hollow. Here they had their first course of mice, the easiest of all game. In teaching, the main thing was example, aided by a deep-set instinct. The old fox also had one or two signs meaning, lie still and watch, come, do as I do, and so on, that were much used. So the merry lot went to this hollow one, calm evening, and Mother Fox made them lie still in the grass. Presently a faint squeak showed that the game was astir. Vix rose up and went on tiptoe into the grass, not crouching but as high as she could stand, sometimes on her hind legs so as to get a better view. The runs that the mice follow are hidden under the grass tangle, and the only way to know the whereabouts of a mouse is by seeing the slight shaking of the grass, which is the reason why mice are hunted only on calm days. And the trick is to locate the mouse and seize him first and see him afterward. Vix soon made a spring, and in the middle of the bunch of dead grass that she grabbed was a field mouse squeaking his last squeak. He was soon gobbled, and the four awkward little foxes tried to do the same as their mother. And when at length the eldest for the first time in his life caught game, he quivered with excitement and ground his pearly little milk teeth into the mouse with a rush of inborn savageness that must have surprised even himself. Another home lesson was on the red squirrel. One of these noisy, vulgar creatures lived close by and used to waste part of each day scolding the foxes from some safe perch. The cubs made many vain attempts to catch him as he ran across their glade from one tree to another, or spluttered and scolded at them a foot or so out of reach. But old Vixen was up in natural history. She knew squirrel nature and took the case in hand when the proper time came. She hid the children and lay down flat in the middle of the open glade. The saucy, low-minded squirrel came and scolded as usual, but she moved no hair. He came nearer and at last right overhead to chatter, "You brute you, you brute you." But Vix lay as dead. This was very perplexing. So the squirrel came down the trunk and peeping about made a nervous dash across the grass to another tree, again to scold from a safe perch. "You brute you useless brute, scar, scar." But flat and lifeless on the grass lay Vix. This was most tantalizing to the squirrel. He was naturally curious and disposed to be venturesome. So again he came to the ground and scurried across the glade nearer than before. Still as death lay, Vix. Surely she was dead. And the little foxes began to wonder if their mother wasn't asleep. But the squirrel was working himself into a little craze of foolhardy curiosity. He had dropped a piece of bark on Vix's head, he had used up his list of bad words, and he had done it all over again, without getting a sign of life. So after a couple more dashes across the glade, he ventured within a few feet of the really watchful Vix, who sprang to her feet and pinned him in a twinkling. And the little ones picked the bones at-oh. Thus the rudiments of their education were laid, and afterward, as they grew stronger, they were taken farther afield to begin the higher branches of trailing and scenting. For each kind of prey they were taught a way to hunt. For every animal has some great strength, or it could not live, and some great weakness, or the others could not live. The squirrel's weakness was foolish curiosity, the fox's that he can't climb a tree, and the training of the little foxes was all shaped to take advantage of the weakness of the other creatures and to make up for their own bide fair play where they are strong. From their parents they learned the chief axioms of the fox world. How is not easy to say. But that they learned this in company with their parents was clear. Here are some that foxes taught me, without saying a word. Never sleep on your straight track. Your nose is before your eyes, then trust it first. A fool runs down the wind. Running rills cure many ills. Never take the open if you can keep the cover. Never leave a straight trail if a crooked one will do. If it's strange, it's hostile. Dust and water burn the scent. Never hunt mice in a rabbit woods or rabbits in a henyard. Keep off the grass. Inklings of the meanings of these were already entering the little ones' minds. Thus, never follow what you can't smell was wise they could see, because if you can't smell it, then the wind is so that it must smell you. One by one they learned the birds and beasts of their home woods, and then as they were able to go abroad with their parents, they learned new animals. They were beginning to think they knew the scent of everything that moved. But one night the mother took them to a field where there was a strange black flat thing on the ground. She brought them on purpose to smell it, but at the first whiff their every hair stood on end. They trembled. They knew not why. It seemed to tingle through their blood and fill them with instinctive hate and fear. And when she saw its full effect, she told them, "That is man's scent." Meanwhile, the hens continued to disappear. I had not betrayed the den of cubs. Indeed, I thought a good deal more of the little rascals than I did of the hens. But Uncle was dreadfully wrought up and made most disparaging remarks about my woodcraft. To please him, I one day took the hound across to the woods, and seating myself on a stump on the open hillside, I bade the dog go on. Within 3 minutes he sang out in the tongue all hunters know so well, "Fox, fox, fox," straight away down the valley. After a while I heard them coming back. There I saw the fox, Scarface, loping lightly across the river bottom to the stream. In he went and trotted along in the shallow water near the margin for 200 yards, then came out straight toward me. Though in full view he saw me not, but came up the hill, watching over his shoulder for the hound. Within 10 feet of me he turned and sat with his back to me, while he craned his neck and showed an eager interest in the doings of Puzzled. But there was only one thing to do. That was by going up and down both banks fine where the fox had left the river. The fox before me shifted his position a little to get a better view, and watched with a most human interest all the circling of the hound. He was so close that I saw the hair of his shoulder bristle a little when the dog came in sight. I could see the jumping of his heart on his ribs and the gleam of his yellow eye. When the dog was wholly balked by the water trick, it was comical to see. He could not sit still, but rocked up and down in glee and reared on his hind feet to get a better view of the slow-plodding hound. With a mouth open nearly to his ears, though not at all winded, he panted noisily for a moment. Or rather, he laughed gleefully, just as a dog laughs by grinning and panting. Old Scarface wriggled in huge enjoyment as the hound puzzled over the trail so long that when he did find it, it was so stale he could barely follow it, and did not feel justified in tonguing on it at all. As soon as the hound was working up the hill, the fox quietly went into the woods. I had been sitting in plain view only 10 feet away, but I had the wind and kept still, and the fox never knew that his life had for 20 minutes been in the power of the foe he most feared. Ranger also would have passed me as near as the fox, but I spoke to him, and with a little nervous start he quit the trail and, looking sheepish, lay down by my feet. This little comedy was played with variations for several days, but it was all in plain view from the house across the river. My uncle, impatient at the daily loss of hens, went out himself, sat on the open knoll, and when old Scarface trotted to his lookout to watch the dull hound on the river fiat below, my uncle remorselessly shot him in the back at the very moment when he was grinning over a new triumph. But still the hens were disappearing. My uncle was wrathy. He determined to conduct the war himself and sowed the woods with poison baits, trusting to luck that our own dogs would not get them. He indulged in contemptuous remarks on my bygone woodcraft and went out evenings with a gun and the two dogs to see what he could destroy. Vix knew right well what a poison bait was. She passed them by or else treated them with active contempt. But once she dropped down the hole of an old enemy, a skunk who was never afterward seen. Formerly, old Scarface was always ready to take charge of the dogs and keep them out of mischief. But now that Vix had the whole burden of the brood, she could no longer spend time in breaking every track to the den, and was not always at hand to meet and mislead the foes that might be coming too near. The end is easily foreseen. Ranger followed a hot trail to the den, and Spot, the fox terrier, announced that the family was at home, and then did his best to go in after them. The whole secret was now out, and the whole family doomed. The hired man came around with pick and shovel to dig them out, while we and the dogs stood by. Old Vix soon showed herself in the near woods, and led the dogs away off down the river, where she shook them off when she thought proper, by the simple device of springing on a sheep's back. The frightened animal ran for several hundred yards, then Vix got off, knowing that there was now a hopeless gap in the scent, and returned to the den. But the dogs, baffled by the break in the trail, soon did the same, to find Vix hanging about in despair, vainly trying to decoy us away from her treasures. Meanwhile, Patty plied both pick and shovel with vigor and effect. The yellow gravelly sand was heaping on both sides, and the shoulders of the sturdy digger were sinking below the level. After an hour's digging, enlivened by frantic rushes of the dogs after the old fox, who hovered near in the woods, Pat called, "Here they are, Sot!" It was the den at the end of the burrow, and cowering as far back as they could were the four little woolly cubs. Before I could interfere, a murderous blow from the shovel and a sudden rush for the fierce little terrier ended the lives of three. The fourth and smallest was barely saved by holding him by his tail high out of reach of the excited dogs. He gave one short squeal, and his poor mother came at the cry and circled so near that she would have been shot but for the accidental protection of the dogs, who somehow always seemed to get between, and whom she once more led away on a fruitless chase. The little one saved alive was dropped into a bag, where he lay quite still. His unfortunate brothers were thrown back into their nursery bed and buried under a few shovelfuls of earth. We guilty ones then went back into the house, and the little fox was soon chained in the yard. No one knew just why he was kept alive, but in all a change of feeling had set in, and the idea of killing him was without a supporter. He was a pretty little fellow, like a cross between a fox and a lamb. His woolly visage and form were strangely lamb-like and innocent, but one could find in his yellow eyes a gleam of cunning and savageness, as unlamb-like as it possibly could be. As long as anyone was near, he crouched sullen and cowed in his shelter box, and it was a full hour after being left alone before he ventured to look out. My window now took the place of the hollow basswood. A number of hens of the breed he knew so well were about the cub in the yard. Late that afternoon, as they strayed near the captive, there was a sudden rattle of the chain, and the youngster dashed at the nearest one and would have caught him, but for the chain which brought him up with a jerk. He got on his feet and slunk back to his box, and though he afterward made several rushes, he so gauged his leap as to win or fail within the length of the chain, and never again was brought up by its cruel jerk. As night came down, the little fellow became very uneasy, sneaking out of his box, but going back at each slight alarm, tugging at his chain, or at times biting it in fury while he held it down with his forepaws. Suddenly he paused as though listening, then raising his little black nose, he poured out a short, quavering cry. Once or twice this was repeated, the time between being occupied in worrying the chain and running about. Then an answer came, the far-away yap-yurr of the old fox. A few minutes later, a shadowy form appeared on the woodpile. The little one slunk into his box, but at once returned and ran to meet his mother with all the gladness that a fox could show. Quick as a flash, she seized him and turned to bear him away by the road she came. But the moment the end of the chain was reached, the cub was rudely jerked from the old one's mouth, and she, scared by the opening of a window, fled over the woodpile. An hour afterward, the cub had ceased to run about or cry. I peeped out, and by the light of the moon saw the form of the mother, at full length on the ground, by the little one, gnawing at something. The clank of iron told what? It was that cruel chain. And Tip, the little one, meanwhile was helping himself to a warm drink. On my going out, the fled into the dark woods, but there by the shelter box were two little mice, bloody and still warm, food for the cub brought by the devoted mother. And in the morning I found the chain was very bright for a foot or two next the little one's collar. On walking across the woods to the ruined den, I again found signs of Vixen. The poor heartbroken mother had come and dug out the bedraggled bodies of her little ones. There lay the three little baby foxes, all licked smooth now, and by them were two of our hens, fresh killed. The newly heaved earth was printed all over with telltale signs, signs that told me that here by the side of her dead, she had watched like Rizpah. Here she had brought their usual meal, the spoil of her nightly hunt. Here she had stretched herself beside them and vainly offered them their natural drink and yearned to feed and warm them as of old. But only stiff little bodies under their soft wool she found, and little cold noses, still and unresponsive. A deep impress of elbows, breasts, and hocks showed where she had laid in silent grief and watched them for long, and mourned as a wild mother can mourn for its young. But from that time she came no more to the ruined den, for now she surely knew that her little ones were dead. Tip the captive, the weakling of the brood, was now the heir to all her love. The dogs were loosed to guard the hens. The hired man had orders to shoot the old fox on sight. So had I, but was resolved never to see her. Chicken heads that a fox loves and a dog will not touch had been poisoned and scattered through the woods, and the only way to the yard where Tip was tied was by climbing the woodpile after braving all other dangers. And yet each night old Vix was there to nurse her baby and bring it fresh killed hens and game. Again and again I saw her, although she came now without awaiting the querulous cry of the captive. The second night of the captivity I heard the rattle of the chain, and then made out that the old fox was there, hard at work digging a hole by the little one's kennel. When it was deep enough to half bury her, she gathered into it all the slack of the chain and filled it again with earth. Then in triumph, thinking she had gotten rid of the chain, she seized little Tip by the neck and turned to dash off up the woodpile. But alas, only to have him jerked roughly from her grasp. Poor little fellow, he whimpered sadly as he crawled into his box. After half an hour there was a great outcry among the dogs, and by their straightaway tonguing through the far wood, I knew they were chasing Vix. Away up north they went in the direction of the railway, and their noise faded from hearing. Next morning the hound had not come back. We soon knew why. Foxes long ago learned what a railroad is. They soon devised several ways of turning it to account. One way is when hunted to walk the rails for a long distance just before a train comes. The scent, always poor on iron, is destroyed by the train, and there is always a chance of hounds being killed by the engine. But another way more sure, but harder to play, is to lead the hounds straight to a high trestle just ahead of the train, so that the engine overtakes them on it, and they are surely dashed to destruction. This trick was skillfully played, and down below we found the mangled remains of Old Ranger, and learned that Vix was already wreaking her revenge. That same night she returned to the yard before Spot's weary limbs could bring him back, and killed another hen and brought it to Tip, and stretched her panting length beside him that he might quench his thirst. For she seemed to think he had no food but what she brought. It was that hen that betrayed to my uncle the nightly visits. My own sympathies were all turning to Vix, and I would have no hand in planning further murders. Next night my uncle himself watched, gun in hand, for an hour. Then when it became cold and the moon clouded over, he remembered other important business elsewhere, and left Paddy in his place. But Paddy was uneasy as the stillness and anxiety of watching worked on his nerves. And the loud bang, bang, an hour later left us sure only that powder had been burned. In the morning we found Vix had not failed her young one. Again next night found my uncle on guards for another hen had been taken. Soon after dark a single shot was heard, but Vix dropped the game she was bringing and escaped. Another attempt made that night called forth another gunshot. Yet next day it was seen by the brightness of the chain that she had come again, and vainly tried for hours to cut that hateful bond. Such courage and staunch fidelity were bound to win respect, if not toleration. At any rate, there was no gunner in wait next night when all was still. Could it be of any use? Driven off thrice with gunshots, would she make another try to feed or free her captive young one? Would she? Hers was a mother's love. There was but one to watch them this time, the fourth night, when the quavering whine of the little one was followed by that shadowy form above the woodpile, but carrying no fowl or food that could be seen. Had the keen huntress failed at last? Had she no head of game for this her only charge? Or had she learned to trust his captors for his food? No, far from all this. The wild wood mother's heart and hate were true. Her only thought had been to set him free. All means she knew she tried, and every danger braved to tend him well and help him to be free. But all had failed. Like a shadow she came, and in a moment was gone, and Tip seized on something dropped, and crunched and chewed with relish what she brought. But even as he ate, a knife-like pang shot through, and a scream of pain escaped him. Then there was a momentary struggle, and the little fox was dead. The mother's love was strong in Vix, but a higher thought was stronger. She knew right well the poison's power. She knew the poison bait, and would have taught him had he lived to know and shun it too. But now at last, when she must choose for him a wretched prisoner's life or sudden death, she quenched the mother in her breast and freed him by the one remaining door. It is when the snow is on the ground that we take the census of the woods. And when the winter came, it told me that Vix no longer roamed the woods of Arendelle. Where she went, it never told, but only this, that she was gone. Gone, perhaps, to some other far-off haunt to leave behind the sad remembrance of her murdered little ones and mate. Or gone, maybe, deliberately from the scene of a sorrowful life, as many a wildwood mother has gone, by the means that she herself had used to free her young one, the last of all her brood. Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton. The Pacing Mustang. Joe Cologne threw down his saddle on the dusty ground, turned his horses loose, and went clanking into the ranch house. "Nigh about chuck time?" he asked. 17 minutes, said the cook, glancing at the Waterbury with the air of a train starter, though this show of precision had never yet been justified by events. "How's things on the Preco?" said Joe's pard. "Hotter'n hinges," said Joe. "Cattle seem okay. Lots of calves. I seen that bunch of Mustangs that waters at Antelope Springs. Couple of colts along, one little dark one, a fair dandy. A born pacer, I run them a mile or two and be led the bunch and never broke his pace. Cut loose and push them just for fun, and darned if I could make him break. You didn't have no refreshments along, said Scarth incredulously. That's all right, Scarth. You had to crawl on our last bet, and you'll get another chance soon as you're man enough. Chuck, shouted the cook, and the subject was dropped. Next day, the scene of the roundup was changed, and the Mustangs were forgotten. A year later, the same corner of New Mexico was worked over by the roundup, and again the Mustang bunch was seen. The dark colt was now a black yearling, with thin, clean legs and glossy flanks, and more than one of the boys saw with his own eyes this oddity. The Mustang was a born pacer. Joe was along, and the idea now struck him that that colt was worth having. To an Easterner, this thought may not seem startling or original, but in the West, where an unbroken horse is worth $5, and where an ordinary saddle horse is worth $15 or $20, the idea of a wild Mustang being desirable property does not occur to the average cowboy, for Mustangs are hard to catch, and when caught are merely wild animal prisoners, perfectly useless and untamable to the last. Not a few of the cattle owners make a point of shooting all Mustangs at sight. They are not only useless cumberers of the feeding grounds, but commonly lead away domestic horses, which soon take to wildlife and are thenceforth lost. Wild Joe Cologne knew a bronc right down to subsoil. I never seen a white that wasn't soft, nor a chestnut that wasn't nervous, nor a bay that wasn't good if broke right, nor a black that wasn't hard as nails and full of the old Harry. All a black bronc wants is claws to be Wusson Daniel's Hull outfit of lions. Since then, a Mustang is worthless vermin, and a black Mustang 10 times worse than worthless. Joe's pard didn't see no sense in Joe's wanting to corral the yearling, as he now seemed intent on doing. But Joe got no chance to try that year. He was only a cowpuncher on $25 a month and tied to hours. Like most of the boys, he always looked forward to having a ranch and an outfit of his own. His brand, the Hog Pen, of sinister suggestion, was already registered at Santa Fe. But of horn stock, it was borne by a single old cow, so as to give him a legal right to put his brand on any maverick or unbranded animal he might chance to find. Yet each fall, when paid off, Joe could not resist the temptation to go to town with the boys and have a good time, while the stuff held out. So that his property consisted of little more than his saddle, his bed, and his old cow. He kept on hoping to make a strike that would leave him well fixed with a fair start, and when the thought came that the black Mustang was his mascot, he only needed a chance to make the try. The roundup circled down to the Canadian River and back in the fall by the Don Carlos Hills, and Joe saw no more of the pacer, though he heard of him from many quarters. For the colt, now a vigorous, young horse, rising 3, was beginning to be talked of. Antelope Springs is in the middle of a great level plain. When the water is high, it spreads into a small lake with a belt of sedge around it. When it is low, there is a wide flat of black mud, glistening white with alkali in places, and the spring a water hole in the middle. It has no flow or outlet and is fairly good water, the only drinking place for many miles. This flat, or prairie as it would be called farther north, was the favorite feeding ground of the black stallion, but it was also the pasture of many herds of range horses and cattle. Chiefly interested was the L Cross F outfit. Foster, the manager and part owner, was a man of enterprise. He believed it would pay to handle a better class of cattle and horses on the range, and one of his ventures was 10 half-blooded mares, tall, clean-limbed, deer-eyed creatures that made the scrub cow ponies look like pitiful starvelings of some degenerate and quite different species. One of these was kept stabled for use, but the 9, after the weaning of their colts, managed to get away and wandered off on the range. A horse has a fine instinct for the road to the best feed, and the 9 mares drifted, of course, to the prairie of Antelope Springs, 20 miles to the southward, and when later that summer Foster went to round them up, he found the 9 indeed, but with them, and guarding them with an air of more than mere comradeship, was a coal-black stallion, prancing around and rounding up the bunch like an expert. His jet-black coat a vivid contrast to the golden hides of his harem. The mares were gentle, and would have been easily driven homeward, but for a new and unexpected thing. The black stallion became greatly aroused. He seemed to inspire them, too, with his wildness, and flying this way and that way, drove the whole band at full gallop where he would. Away they went, and the little cow ponies that carried the men were easily left behind. This was maddening, and both men at last drew their guns and sought a chance to drop that blasted stallion. But no chance came that was not 9-1 of dropping one of the mares. A long day of maneuvering made no change. The pacer, for it was he, kept his family together and disappeared among the southern sandhills. The cattlemen on their jaded ponies set out for home, with the poor satisfaction of vowing vengeance for their failure on the superb cause of it. One of the most aggravating parts of it was that one or two experiences like this would surely make the mares as wild as the Mustang, and there seemed to be no way of saving them from it. Scientists differ on the power of beauty and prowess to attract female admiration among the lower animals. But whether it is admiration or the prowess itself, it is certain that a wild animal of uncommon gifts soon wins a large following from the harems of his rivals. And the great black horse, with his inky mane and tail and his green-lighted eyes, ranged through all that region and added to his following from many bands till not less than a score of mares were in his bunch. Most were merely humble cow ponies turned out to range, but the 9 great mares were there, a striking group by themselves. According to all reports, this bunch was always kept rounded up and guarded with such energy and jealously that a mare, once in it, was a lost animal so far as man was concerned. And the ranchmen realized soon that they had gotten on the range a Mustang that was doing them more harm than all other sources of loss put together. It was December 1893. I was new in the country and was setting out from the ranch house on the Pinavetitos to go with a wagon to the Canadian River. As I was leaving, Foster finished his remark by, "And if you get a chance to draw a bead on that accursed Mustang, don't fail to drop him in his tracks." This was the first I had heard of him, and as I rode along, I gathered from Burns, my guide, the history that has been given. I was full of curiosity to see the famous 3-year-old, and was not a little disappointed on the second day when we came to the prairie on Antelope Springs and saw no sign of the pacer or his band. But on the next day, as we crossed the Alamosa Arroyo and were rising to the rolling prairie again, Jack Burns, who was riding on ahead, suddenly dropped flat on the neck of his horse and swung back to me in the wagon, saying, "Get out your rifle, here's that stallion." I seized my rifle and hurried forward to a view over the prairie ridge. In the hollow below was a band of horses, and there at one end was the great black Mustang. He had heard some sound of our approach and was not unsuspicious of danger. There he stood with head and tail erect and nostrils wide, an image of horse perfection and beauty, as noble an animal as ever ranged the plains, and the mere notion of turning that magnificent creature into a massive carrion was horrible. In spite of Jack's exhortation to shoot quick, I delayed and threw open the breech, whereupon he, always hot and hasty, swore at my slowness, growled, "Give me that gun!" And as he seized it, I turned the muzzle up, and accidentally the gun went off. Instantly, the herd below was all alarm. The great black leader snorted and neighed and dashed about, and the mares bunched, and away all went in a rumble of hooves and a cloud of dust. The stallion careered now on this side, now on that, and kept his eye on all, and led and drove them far away. As long as I could see, I watched, and never once did he break his pace. Jack made Western remarks about me and my gun, as well as that Mustang, but I rejoiced in the pacer's strength and beauty, and not for all the mares in the bunch would I have harmed his glossy hide. There are several ways of capturing wild horses. One is by creasing, that is, grazing the animal's nape with a rifle ball so that he is stunned long enough for hobbling. Yes, I seen about 100 necks broke trying it, but I never seen a Mustang creased yet, was Wild Joe's critical remark. Sometimes if the shape of the country abets it, the herd can be driven into a corral. Sometimes with extra fine mounts they can be run down. But by far the commonest way, paradoxical as it may seem, is to walk them down. The fame of the stallion that never was known to gallop was spreading. Extraordinary stories were told of his gait, his speed, and his win. And when old Montgomery of the Triangle Bar outfit came out plumb at Wells Hotel in Clayton, and in presence of witnesses said he'd give $1,000 cash for him, safe in a boxcar, providing the stories were true, a dozen young cowpunchers were eager to cut loose and win the purse as soon as present engagements were up. But Wild Joe had had his eye on this very deal for quite a while. There was no time to lose, so, ignoring present contracts, he rustled all night to raise the necessary equipment for the game. By straining his already overstrained credit and taxing the already overtaxed generosity of his friends, Lee got together an expedition consisting of 20 good saddle horses, a mess wagon, and a fortnight's stuff for 3 men, himself, his pard, Charlie, and the cook. Then they set out from Clayton with the avowed intention of walking down the wonderfully swift wild horse. The third day they arrived at Antelope Springs, and as it was about noon, they were not surprised to see the black pacer marching down to drink with all his band behind him. Joe kept out of sight until the wild horses each and all had drunk their fill, for a thirsty animal always travels better than one laden with water. Joe then rode quietly forward. The pacer took alarm at half a mile and led his band away out of sight on the soapweed mesa to the southeast. Joe followed at a gallop till he once more sighted them, then came back and instructed the cook, who was also teamster, to make for Alamosa Arroyo in the south. Then away to the southeast he went after the Mustangs. After a mile or two he once more sighted them, and walked his horse quietly till so near that they again took alarm and circled away to the south. An hour's trot, not on the trail, but cutting across to where they ought to go, brought Joe again in close sight. Again he walked quietly toward the herd, and again there was the alarm and fright. And so they passed the afternoon, but circled ever more and more to the south, so that when the sun was low they were, as Joe had expected, not far from Alamosa Arroyo. The band was again close at hand, and Joe, after starting them off, rode to the wagon, while his pard, who had been taking it easy, took up the slow chase on a fresh horse. After supper, the wagon moved on to the upper ford of the Alamosa, as arranged, and there camped for the night. Meanwhile, Charlie followed the herd. They had not run so far as at first, for their pursuer made no sign of attack, and they were getting used to his company. They were more easily found as the shadows fell on account of a snow-white mare that was in the bunch. A young moon in the sky now gave some help, and relying on his horse to choose the path, Charlie kept him quietly walking after the herd, represented by that ghost-white mare, till they were lost in the night. He then got off, unsaddled and picketed his horse, and in his blanket quickly went to sleep. At the first streak of dawn he was up, and within a short half-mile, thanks to the snowy mare, he found the band. At his approach, the shrill neigh of the pacer bugled his troop into a flying squad. But on the first mesa they stopped and faced about to see what this persistent follower was and what he wanted. For a moment or so they stood against the sky to gaze, and then deciding that he knew him as well as he wished to, that black meteor flung his mane on the wind and led off at his tireless, even swing, while the mares came streaming after. Away they went, circling now to the west, and after several repetitions of the same play, flying, following, and overtaking, and flying again, they passed near noon, the old Apache lookout, Buffalo Bluff. Anti here on watch was Joe. A long, thin column of smoke told Charlie to come to camp, and with a flashing pocket mirror he made response. Joe, freshly mounted, rode across, and again took up the chase, and back came Chansey to camp to eat and rest, and then move on upstream. All that day Joe followed and managed when it was needed that the herd should keep the great circle, of which the wagon cut a small cord. At sundown he came to Verde Crossing, and there was Charlie with a fresh horse and food, and Joe went on in the same calm, dogged way. All the evening he followed and far into the night, for the wild herd was now getting somewhat used to the presence of the harmless strangers, and were more easily followed. Moreover, they were thing out with perpetual traveling. They were no longer in the good grass country. They were not grain-fed like the horses on their track, and above all, the slight but continuous nervous tension was surely telling. It spoiled their appetites but made them very thirsty. They were allowed, and as far as possible encouraged, to drink deeply at every chance. The effect of large quantities of water on a running animal is well known. It tends to stiffen the limbs and spoil the wind. Joe carefully guarded his own horse against such excess, and both he and his horse were fresh when they camped that night on the trail of the jaded Mustangs. At dawn, he found them easily close at hand, and though they ran at first, they did not go far before they dropped into a walk. The battle seemed nearly won now, for the chief difficulty in the walkdown is to keep track of the herd the first 2 or 3 days when they are fresh. All that morning, Joe kept in sight, generally in close sight, of the band. About 10 o'clock, Charlie relieved him near Joseph. Peaking that day, the Mustangs walked only a quarter of a mile ahead, with much less spirit than the day before, and circled now more north again. At night, Charlie was supplied with a fresh horse and followed as before. Next day, the Mustangs walked with heads held low, and in spite of the efforts of the black pacer at times, they were less than 100 yards ahead of their pursuer. The fourth and fifth days passed the same way, and now the herd was nearly back to Antelope Springs. So far, all had come out as expected. The chase had been in a great circle with the wagon following a lesser circle. The wild herd was back to its starting point, worn out, and the hunters were back, fresh and on fresh horses. The herd was kept from drinking till late in the afternoon, and then driven to the springs to swell themselves with a perfect water gorge. Now was the chance for the skillful ropers on the grain-fed horses to close in, for the sudden heavy drink was ruination, almost paralysis of wind and limb, and it would be easy to rope and hobble them one by one. There was only one weak spot in the program, the black stallion. The cause of the hunt seemed made of iron. That ceaseless swinging pace seemed as swift and vigorous now as on the morning when the chase began. Up and down he went, rounding up the herd and urging them on by voice and example to escape. But they were played out. The old white mare that had been such help in sighting them at night had dropped out hours ago, dead beat. The half-bloods seemed to be losing all fear of the horsemen. The band was clearly in Joe's power. But the one who was the prize of all the hunt seemed just as far as ever out of reach. Here was a puzzle. Joe's comrades knew him well and would not have been surprised to see him in a sudden rage attempt to shoot the stallion down. But Joe had no such mind. During that long week of following, he had watched the horse all day at speed, and never once had he seen him gallop. The horseman's adoration of a noble horse had grown and grown, till now he would as soon have thought of shooting his best mount as firing on that splendid beast. Joe even asked himself whether he would take the handsome sum that was offered for the prize. Such an animal would be a fortune in himself to sire a race of pacers for the track. But the prize was still at large. The time had come to finish up the hunt. Joe's finest mount was caught. She was a mare of eastern blood, but raised on the plains. She never would have come into Joe's possession but for a curious weakness. The loco is a poisonous weed that grows in these regions. Most stock will not touch it, but sometimes an animal tries it and becomes addicted to it. It acts somewhat like morphine, but the animal, though sane for long intervals, has always a passion for the herb and finally dies mad. A beast with the craze is said to be locoed, and Joe's best mount had a wild gleam in her eye that to an expert told the tale. But she was swift and strong, and Joe chose her for the grand finish of the chase. It would have been an easy matter now to rope the mares, but was no longer necessary. They could be separated from their black leader and driven home to the corral. But that leader still had the look of untamed strength. Joe, rejoicing in a worthy foe, went bounding forth to try the odds. The lasso was flung on the ground and trailed to take out every kink, and gathered as he rode into neatest coils across his left palm. Then, putting on the spur the first time in that chase, he rode straight for the stallion a quarter of a mile beyond. Away he went, and away went Joe, each at his best, while the fagged-out mares scattered right and left and let them pass. Straight across the open plain the fresh horse went at its hardest gallop, and the stallion, leading off, still kept his start and kept his famous swing. It was incredible, and Joe put on more spur and shouted to his horse, which fairly flew, but shortened up the space between by not a single inch. For the black one whirled across the flat and up and past a soapweed mesa, and down across a sandy, treacherous plain, then over a grassy stretch where prairie dogs barked, then hid below, and on came Joe. But there to see, could he believe his eyes? The stallion's start grown longer still, and Joe began to curse his luck and urge and spur his horse until the poor, uncertain brute got into such a state of nervous fright. Her eyes began to roll. She wildly shook her head from side to side, no longer picked her ground. A badger hole received her foot, and down she went, and Joe went flying to the earth. Though badly bruised, he gained his feet and tried to mount his crazy beast. But she, poor brute, was done for. Her off foreleg hung loose. There was but one thing to do. Joe loosed the cinch, put Lightfoot out of pain, and carried back the saddle to the camp, while the pacer steamed away till lost to view. This was not quite defeat, for all the mares were manageable now, and Joe and Charlie drove them carefully to the El Cross F corral and claimed a good reward. But Joe was more than ever bound to own the stallion. He had seen what stuff he was made of. He prized him more, and only sought to strike some better plan to catch him. The cook on that trip was Bates. Mr. Thomas Bates, he called himself at the post office, where he regularly went for the letters and remittance which never came. Old Tom Turkey Track, the boys called him, from his cattle brand, which he said was on record at Denver, and which, according to his story, was also borne by countless beef and saddle stock on the plains of the unknown north. When asked to join the trip as a partner, Bates made some sarcastic remarks about horses not fetching $12 a dozen, which had been literally true within the year, and he preferred to go on a very meager salary. But no one who once saw the pacer going had failed to catch the craze. Turkey Track experienced the usual change of heart. He now wanted to own that Mustang. How this was to be brought about, he did not clearly see till one day there called at the ranch that had secured his services. As he put it, one Bill Smith, more usually known as Horseshoe Billy, from his cattle brand. While the excellent fresh beef and bread and the vile coffee, dried peaches and molasses were being consumed, he of the Horseshoe remarked, in tones which percolated through a huge stopgap of bread, "Wall, I seen that there pacer today, nigh enough to put a plate in his tail." "What, you didn't shoot?" "No, but I come mighty near it." "Don't you be led into no sich foolishness," said a double-bar H cowpuncher at the other end of the table. "I calculate that maverick'll carry my brand before the moon changes. You'll have to be pretty spry, or you'll find a triangle dot on his weather side when you get there." "Where did you run across him?" "Well, it was like this. I was riding the flat by Antelope Springs, and I sees a lump on the dry mud inside the rush belt. I knowed I never seen that before, so I rides up thinking it might be some of our stock, and seen it was a horse lying plumb flat. The wind was blowing like from him to me, so I rides up close and seen it was the pacer, dead as a mackerel. Still, he didn't look swelled or cut, and there went no smell, and I didn't know what to think till I seen his ear twitch off a fly, and then I knowed he was sleeping. I gets down me rope and coils it, and seen it was old and pretty shaky in spots, and me saddle a single cinch, and me pony about 700 again, a 1,200-pound stallion. And I sees to meself, says I, 'Tain't no use, I'll only break me cinch and get throwed and lose me saddle.' So I hits the saddle horn a crack with the Hondu, and I wish it you'd have seen that Mustang. He leapt 6 foot in the air and snorted like he was shunting cars. His eyes fairly bugged out, and he lighted out lickety-split for California. And he orter be there about now if he kept on like he started. And I swear he never made a break the whole trip." The story was not quite so consecutive as given here. It was much punctuated by present engrossments, and from first to last was more or less infiltrated through the necessaries of life. For Bill was a healthy young man, without a trace of false shame. But the account was complete, and everyone believed it, for Billy was known to be reliable. Of all those who heard, Old Turkey Track talked the least, and probably thought the most, for it gave him a new idea. During his after-dinner pipe, he studied it out, and deciding that he could not go it alone, he took Horseshoe Billy into his counsel, and the result was a partnership in a new venture to capture the pacer. That is, the $5,000 that was now said to be the offer for him safe in a boxcar. Antelope Springs was still the usual watering place of the pacer. The water being low left a broad belt of dry black mud between the sedge and the spring. At two places, this belt was broken by a well-marked trail made by the animals coming to drink. Horses and wild animals usually kept to these trails, though the horned cattle had no hesitation in taking a shortcut through the sedge. In the most used of these trails, the two men set to work with shovels and dug a pit 15 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 7 feet deep. It was a hard 20 hours work for them, as it had to be completed between the Mustang's drinks, and it began to be very damp work before it was finished. With poles, brush, and earth, it was then cleverly covered over and concealed, and the men went to a distance and bid in pits made for the purpose. About noon the pacer came, alone now since the capture of his band. The trail on the opposite side of the mud belt was little used, and old Tom, by throwing some fresh rushes across it, expected to make sure that the stallion would enter by the other, if indeed he should by any caprice try to come by the unusual path. What sleepless angel is it watches over and cares for the wild animals? In spite of all reasons to take the usual path, the pacer came along the other. The suspicious-looking rushes did not stop him. He walked calmly to the water and drank. There was only one way now to prevent utter failure. When he lowered his head for the second draft, which horses always take, Bates and Smith quit their holes and ran swiftly toward the trail behind him. And when he raised his proud head, Smith sent a revolver shot into the ground behind him. Away went the pacer at his famous gait straight to the trap. Another second, and he would be into it. Already he is on the trail, and already they feel they have him. But the angel of the wild things is with him. That incomprehensible warning comes, and with one mighty bound he clears the 15 feet of treacherous ground and spurns the earth as he fades away unharmed, never again to visit Antelope Springs by either of the beaten paths. Wild Joe never lacked energy. He meant to catch that Mustang, and when he learned that others were bestirring themselves for the same purpose, he at once set about trying the best untried plan he knew, the plan by which the coyote catches the fleeter jackrabbit and the mounted Indian the far swifter antelope, the old plan of the relay chase. The Canadian River on the south, its affluent, the Pinavetitos Arroyo on the northeast, and the Don Carlos Hills with the Ute Creek Canyon on the west, formed a 60-mile triangle that was the range of the pacer. It was believed that he never went outside this, and at all times Antelope Springs was his headquarters. Joe knew this country well, all the waterholes and cannon crossings as well as the ways of the pacer. If he could have gotten 50 good horses, he could have posted them to advantage so as to cover all points. But 20 mounts and 5 good riders were all that proved available. The horses, grain-fed for 2 weeks before, were sent on ahead. Each man was instructed how to play his part and sent to his post the day before the race. On the day of the start, Joe with his wagon drove to the plain of Antelope Springs and, camping far off in a little draw, waited. At last he came, that coal-black horse, out from the sand hills at the south, alone as always now, and walked calmly down to the springs and circled quite around it to sniff for any hidden foe. Then he approached where there was no trail at all and drank. Joe watched and wished that he would drink a hogshead. But the moment that he turned and sought the grass, Joe spurred his steed. The pacer heard the hoofs, then saw the running horse, and did not want a nearer view but led away. Across the flat he went down to the south, and kept the famous swinging gait that made his start grow longer. Now through the sandy dunes he went, and steadying to an even pace he gained considerably, and Joe's too-laden horse plunged through the sand, and sinking fetlock deep, he lost at every bound. Then came a level stretch where the runner seemed to gain, and then a long decline where Joe's horse dared not run his best, so lost again at every step. But on they went, and Joe spared neither spur nor quirt. A mile, and another mile, and the far-off rock at Arriba loomed up ahead. And there Joe knew fresh mounts were held, and on they dashed. But the night-black mane out level on the breeze ahead was gaining more and more. Arriba Cannon reached at last. The watcher stood aside, for it was not wished to turn the race, and the stallion passed, dashed down, across, and up the slope, with that unbroken pace, the only one he knew. And Joe came bounding on his foaming steed, and on the waiting mount, then urged him down the slope and up upon the track, and on the upland once more drove in the spurs and raced and raced and raced. But not a single inch he gained. Galum, galum, galum. With measured beat he went, an hour, and another hour. Arroyo Alamosa just ahead with fresh relays, and Joe yelled at his horse and pushed him on and on. Straight for the place the black one made. But on the last 2 miles, some strange foreboding turned him to the left, and Joe foresaw escape in this, and pushed his jaded mount at any cost to head him off. And hard as they had raced, this was the hardest race of all, with gasps for breath and leather squeaks at every straining bound. Then cutting right across, Joe seemed to gain, and drawing his gun he fired shot after shot to toss the dust, and so turned the stallion's head and forced him back to take the crossing to the right. Down they went. The stallion crossed and Joe sprang to the ground. His horse was done, for 30 miles had passed in the last stretch, and Joe himself was worn out. His eyes were burnt with flying alkali dust. He was half blind, so he motioned to his pard to go ahead and keep him straight for Alamosa Ford. Out shot the rider on a strong, fresh steed, and away they went, up and down on the rolling plain, the black horse flecked with snowy foam. His heaving ribs and noisy breath showed what he felt, but on he went. And Tom on Ginger seemed to gain, then lose and lose, when in an hour the long decline of Alamosa came. And there a freshly mounted lad took up the chase and turned it west. And on they went past towns of prairie dogs, through soapweed tracks and cactus breaks by scores, and pricked and wrenched rode on. With dust and sweat, the black was now a dappled brown, but still he stepped the same. Young Carrington, who followed, bad hurt his steed by pushing at the very start, and spurred and urged him now to cut across a gulch at which the pacer shied. Just one misstep, and down they went. The boy escaped, but the pony lies there yet, and the wild black horse kept on. This was close to old Gallego's ranch, where Joe himself had cut across refreshed to push the chase. Within 30 minutes, he was again scorching the pacer's trail. Far in the west, the Carlos Hills were seen, and there Joe knew fresh men and mounts were waiting, and that way the indomitable rider tried to turn. The race, but by a sudden whim, of the inner warning born perhaps, the pacer turned. Sharp to the north he went, and Joe, the skillful wrangler, rode and yelled and tossed the dust with shots. But down on a gulch the wild black meteor streamed, and Joe could only follow. Then came the hardest race of all. Joe, cruel to the Mustang, was crueler to his mount and to himself. The sun was hot, the scorching plain was dim in shimmering heat, his eyes and lips were burnt with sand and salt, and yet the chase sped on. The only chance to win would be if he could drive the Mustang back to the big Arroyo crossing. Now almost for the first time he saw signs of weakening in the black. His mane and tail were not just quite so high, and his short half-mile of start was down by more than half. But still he stayed ahead and paced and paced and paced. An hour and another hour, and still they went the same. But they turned again, and night was near when Big Arroyo Ford was reached. Fully 20 miles. But Joe was game. He seized the waiting horse. The one he left went gasping to the stream and gorged himself with water till he died. Then Joe held back in hopes the foaming black would drink. But he was wise. He gulped a single gulp, splashed through the stream, and then passed on with Joe at speed behind him. And when they last were seen, the black was on ahead, just out of reach, and Joe's horse bounding on. It was morning when Joe came to camp on foot. His tale was briefly told. 8 horses dead, 5 men worn out, the matchless pacer safe and free. "'Tain't possible, it can't be done. Sorry I didn't bore his hellish carcass through when I had the chance," said Joe and gave it up. Old Turkey Track was cook on this trip. He had watched the chase with as much interest as anyone, and when it failed he grinned into the pot and said, "That Mustang's mine unless I'm a darn fool." Then falling back on scripture for a precedent, as was his habit, he still addressed the pot. "Reckon the Philistines tried to run Samson down, and they got done up, and would have stayed Donany for a natural weakness on his part. And Adam would have loafed in Eden yidit oni for a leetle failing, which we all understand. And it ain't 5,000 I'll take for him nother. Much persecution had made the pacer wilder than ever, but it did not drive him away from Antelope Springs. That was the only drinking place with absolutely no shelter for a mile on every side to hide an enemy. Here he came almost every day about noon, and after thoroughly spying, the land approached to drink. His had been a lonely life all winter since the capture of his harem, and of this old turkey track was fully aware. The old cook's chum had a nice little brown mare which he judged would serve his ends, and taking a pair of the strongest hobbles, a spade, a spare lasso, and a stout post, he mounted the mare and rode away to the famous springs. A few antelope skimmed over the plain before him in the early freshness of the day. Cattle were lying about in groups, and the loud, sweet song of the prairie lark was heard on every side. For the bright, snowless winter of the mesas was gone, and the springtime was at hand. The grass was greening, and all nature seemed turning to thoughts of love. It was in the air, and when the little brown mare was picketed out to graze, she raised her nose from time to time to pour forth a long, shrill whinny that surely was her song, if song she had, of love. Old Turkey Track studied the wind and the lay of the land. There was the pit he had labored at, now opened and filled with water that was rank with drowned prairie dogs and mice. Here was the new trail the animals were forced to make by the pit. He selected a sedgy clump near some smooth grassy ground, and first firmly sunk the post, then dug a hole large enough to hide in and spread his blanket in it. He shortened up the little mare's tether till she could scarcely move. Then on the ground between he spread his open lasso, tying the long end to the post, then covered the rope with dust and grass and went into his hiding place. About noon, after long waiting, the amorous whinny of the mare was answered from the high ground, away to the west, and there, black against the sky, was the famous Mustang. Down he came at that long, swinging gait, but grown crafty with much pursuit. He often stopped to gaze and whinny, and got answer that surely touched his heart. Nearer he came again to call, then took alarm, and paced all around in a great circle to try the wind for his foes, and seemed in doubt. The angel whispered, "Don't go." But the brown mare called again. He circled nearer still, and neighed once more, and got reply that seemed to quell all fears, and set his heart aglow. Nearer still he pranced, till he touched Solly's nose with his own, and finding her as responsive as he well could wish, thrust aside all thoughts of danger and abandoned himself to the delight of conquest, until, as he pranced around, his hind legs for a moment stood within the evil circle of the rope. One deft, sharp twitch, the noose flew tight, and he was caught. A snort of terror and a bound in the air gave Tom the chance to add the double hitch. The loop flashed up the line, and snake-like bound those mighty hoofs. Terror lent speed and double strength for a moment, but the end of the rope was reached, and down he went a captive, a hopeless prisoner at last. Old Tom's ugly little crooked form sprang from the pit to complete the mastering of the great, glorious creature, whose mighty strength had proved as nothing when matched with the wits of a little old man. With snorts and desperate bounds of awful force, the great beast dashed and struggled to be free, but all in vain. The rope was strong. The second lasso was deftly swung, and the 4 feet caught, and then with a skillful move the feet were drawn together, and down went the raging pacer to lie a moment later, hog-tied and helpless on the ground. There he struggled till worn out, sobbing great convulsive sobs while tears ran down his cheeks. Tom stood by and watched, but a strange revulsion of feeling came over the old cowpuncher. He trembled nervously from head to foot, as he had not done since he roped his first steer, and for a while could do nothing but gaze on his tremendous prisoner. But the feeling soon passed away. He saddled Delilah, and taking the second lasso, roped the great horse about the neck, and left the mare to hold the stallion's head while he put on the hobbles. This was soon done, and sure of him now, old Bates was about to loose the ropes, but on a sudden thought he stopped. He had quite forgotten and had come unprepared for something of importance. In Western law, the Mustang was the property of the first man to mark him with his brand. How was this to be done with the nearest branding iron 20 miles away? Old Tom went to his mare, took up her hoofs one at a time, and examined each shoe. Yes, one was a little loose. He pushed and pried it with the spade and got it off. Buffalo chips and kindred fuel were plentiful about the plain, so a fire was quickly made, and he soon had one arm of the horseshoe red hot. Then holding the other wrapped in his sock, he rudely sketched on the left shoulder of the helpless Mustang a turkey track. His brand the first time really that it had ever been used. The pacer shuddered as the hot iron seared his flesh, but it was quickly done, and the famous Mustang stallion was a maverick no more. Now all there was to do was to take him home. The ropes were loosed, the Mustang felt himself freed, thought he was free, and sprang to his feet only to fall as soon as he tried to take a stride. His forefeet were strongly tied together, his only possible gait a shuffling walk, or else a desperate labored bounding, with feet so unnaturally held that within a few yards he was inevitably thrown, each time he tired to break away. Tom on the light pony headed him off again and again, and by dint of driving, threatening, and maneuvering, contrived to force his foaming, crazy captive northward toward the Pinavetitos Canyon. But the wild horse would not drive, would not give in. With snorts of terror or of rage and maddest bounds, he tried and tried to get away. It was one long, cruel fight. His glossy sides were thick with dark foam, and the foam was stained with blood. Countless hard falls and exhaustion that a long day's chase was powerless to produce were telling on him. His straining bounds first this way and then that were not now quite so strong, and the spray he snorted as he gasped was half a spray of blood. But his captor, relentless, masterful, and cool, still forced him on. Down the slope toward the canyon they had come, every yard a fight, and now they were at the head of the draw that took the trail down to the only crossing of the canyon, the northmost limit of the Pacer's ancient range. From this the first corral and ranch house were in sight. The man rejoiced, but the Mustang gathered his remaining strength for one more desperate dash. Up the grassy slope from the trail he went, defied the swinging, slashing rope, and the gunshot fired in air, in vain attempt to turn his frenzied course. Up, and on above the sheerest cliff he dashed, then sprang away into the vacant air, down, 200 downward feet to fall, and land upon the rocks below, a lifeless wreck, but free.